Hello, this is Dr. Martin. So in chapter one, this is our second series of notes. In chapter one of your textbook, there are three sections. There's chapter 1.1, which is the previous set of slides and lecture, kind of long, kind of lengthy, kind of meaty, and this won't be nearly as long. This series of notes here is on section 1.2, and then we'll have another one here in another couple of days on section 1.3. So three sections in chapter one. This is the second series of notes that we'll have. So get right into it. This is chapter 1, section 2, 1.2. This is called the science of taxonomy, or the what we call the science of naming organisms. For science, it's important for us to name living organisms, specific names. You've heard this in high school biology. It's the species name, but we want to start out kind of general. I don't want to bore you too much. This is a very short section, very brief lecture here. But this began more than 2,000 years ago with a scientist named Aristotle. Aristotle was kind of like the European father of philosophy, the European father of biology, whatever that means. But Aristotle was smart enough to know that, like, for instance, whales were not fish. He knew that. He knew the anatomical differences between the fishes and mammals, birds. He began to name organisms. He was very good with plants, very good at naming and collecting plants. Some specimens we still have in museums across the world, especially in Europe. So this science of naming organisms is very important, that every organism have a name. Well, generally speaking, we start much broader and much bigger and much more general than that. This slide right here describes that. We basically distribute life into one of three main categories, or three main boxes, or three main cubby holes. Here's those three. First, there's the domain bacteria. We're pretty familiar with that, all bacteria. You have about uh, hundreds of bacteria living both on your skin and your body, but also inside of you, in your intestinal tract in particular, that are very important. E. coli, Escherichia coli, lives in your colon, the colon of every human, the colon of most mammals. And we use Escherichia coli to help us break down and ferment sugars that you consume in your diet. So we're pretty familiar with the domain bacteria. Very small, very primitive, very simple cells, one-celled organisms, unicellular organism, uni meaning one. Then there's the domain archaea, a very kind of marginal group, a very small group of one-celled organisms. Don't want to say they're inconsequential, but they're not as significant as some of the other two domains that we're talking about. Then there's the domain eukarya, and eu meaning new, and these are much more complex, larger organisms. Some of them are one-celled organisms, but they're still very complex. And so these are the three domains. All forms of life are broadly categorized into one of these three domains. So, but what we also do is we divide these domains into kingdoms. Now, what we do is we start very broad, and then we telescope down and get smaller and smaller and smaller until ultimately we get to a species like you and I. Homo sapiens is our scientific name. Well, the first thing we have to do is we take these domains and we divide them into kingdoms. Uh, there are different kingdoms of the eukarya in particular, different kingdoms of the bacteria and the archaea. But there's, for instance, the domain eukarya is broken down into the kingdom Animalia, Plantae, fungi, and the protistans, four different kingdoms. And then those kingdoms are broken down into smaller groups. those groups are broken down into smaller groups. And so we tend to telescope smaller and smaller and smaller as we go. But we divide these domains into kingdoms that are just kind of lineages. And the bacteria and the archaea, we said they're very primitive. There's a couple of nice pictures here of we could make so many different pictures of the domain bacteria, but they're very small, very primitive. They lack very specific cellular structures. They're small, very small to see. We study these in microbiology. Uh, we really have to have some specialized microscopes and some specialized techniques just to see them. But we study bacteria in microbiology, and we'll study a little bit more about them later. They don't really even they have DNA, but they don't have a nucleus. Remember that from high school biology? They don't have a nucleus that contains their DNA. The archaea, again, very primitive, very small, very unique environments that they live in on the earth, deep sea vents, volcanic heat vents in the Atlantic Ocean, very, very extreme environments, very small group. But those are the domain bacteria and the domain eukarya. But I'm sorry, the domain uh, archaea. But here in this kingdom here, eukarya, you meaning new. This is a pretty large group. Most higher organisms fall into this category. Plants, animals, fungus. Here's the group Protista, the protists. They're a pretty diverse group, but they're only one-celled organisms. Uh, but they have cells that consist of almost all structures. They're pretty complex, but they're only one-celled organisms. Here's some common names: slime molds, algae, amoebas. They tend to fall into this category. One-celled organisms, but they're a different kind of cells than the other two domains in bacteria and archaea. So in this eukarya group, there's the protistans. And then we also have the kingdom Animalia. Animals, pretty familiar with them. They include the vertebrates. Those are the higher animals, um, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, and the fishes. They all fall into this, but also invertebrates, which are insects, crustaceans. All of these are in the kingdom Animalia, the animals. Now, animals have different cell types than fungi. You know a fungus. Fungus on our bodies. There are several pathogenic type of fungus. About 100 different fungal species that are pathogenic on humans. But mushrooms, toadstools, molds, all of these are fungi, but they're classified as higher organisms. They're not animals and they're not plants. Notice this fungus here is not green, so they're not plants. So they're not animals, they're not plants, something kind of in between. And this is the kingdom fungi. So in this eukarya domain, we have the protists, the animals, the fungi, and then we have this group here, the plants. And you're very obviously familiar with these, but these are the producers that we talked about in the previous chapter. They capture light, sunlight, have special cells that capture certain wavelengths of light. They convert that into energy. They make their energy. You and I eat ours, but they make their energy. But they're obviously very important to the earth. So in this one domain of eukarya, we have the animals, the fungi, the plants, and the protista. All of them much more complex cells. So to end this up, there are a couple of questions here, a couple of clicker questions. You can answer these as we go, and just as a bit of a review for you. But that's all on this particular section, chapter 1.2. And now remember, these notes are also found in another module, another link in the module where you can take a little more time and walk through these, build your own notes, build your own study guide. These are just a little bit of an interpretation. So I'll have section 1.3, chapter 1.3 notes up here in another day or so.